All right, so with our awesome constraints set up, ready to go, let's actually make our simulation aware of it. So I'm going to do it after the rigid body solver here. Constraint, I spelled it wrong. Constraint network. Put that in here. And we need to point to it. So we'll say the second context geometry, because that's what it is. We have it coming into the second input. Second context geometry. Now this is a hazard. Overwrite with SOP. There's a little Houdini expression on here that's basically looking to see, is our incoming path, is it animated? Meaning, are the constraints being changed from frame to frame? If they are, then we should be overriding our whole constraint network with that input. It's almost never what you want. It's trying to be clever by detecting whether it's changing or not. And if it's not changing, there's no problem. The thing is that a lot of times you can accidentally have it be changing, or Houdini thinks it's changing, or as we'll find, at least as of this version of Houdini, when we do tops later to do our wedging, it's going to make it think that it is. Long story short, delete channels, turn it off. We don't ever want this. It's still going to load it the first time, regardless of whether this is on or not. Now, it's still complaining because we haven't actually given it any constraint types to match. So what we want is the glue constraint relationship. Plug that in, change the data name to glue if Houdini hasn't already updated itself to always do that by now. Now we can see them. I mean, they're in there anyway. They're there on top of the actual pieces. If I turn the pieces off, I can see them easier. But the fact that we see it at all means that it successfully found it. It's the constraint name, it's the thing from here, glue, aka the, again, constraint name string attribute that needs to match this. If it doesn't, then it won't work. It'll disappear. So just if yours is not showing up, make sure that by the time you get to this constraints thing here and you look at it in your geometry spreadsheet, constraint name better match what's there. So that's how we get it. And now a very important thing to do is change these values to 1. Because by default, they're not 1. What will happen is the stuff that we set up, all those attributes we set, like the strength, it's going to multiply them by this. So it's going to be 100 times this. It's even our half-life of 0.1 will be times this. So put them at 1 so that the actual attributes we set here will work as we expect them to. That's a pretty common gotcha. So let's turn off the metaball force for a second, and let's see what we got here. If I press play, what's going to happen? I mean, I know what's going to happen, but it's not bad, actually. It's keeping it together, certainly. The constraints are holding. The thing is, technically, and I'm kind of a little surprised this isn't happening, what can happen is the bottom will break, because the bottom is just colliding with the ground. It's not connected to the ground. I'm actually very surprised if that's doing that. Let's see what happens if I switch my piece versions to the lower res version. Oh, that's why it didn't happen, because I have the output on the constraint network itself. So that's a pretty good lesson here as well. I'm going to put this back to 1. In our DOP network, the node that currently has the orange flag on it is the one that is the result of our network, which means it's not doing a collision with the ground plane, and it's not even getting gravity. So make sure that our orange thing is down here. Now you can see the ground plane showed up. So what I expected to happen was that it would break these constraints on the bottom, and it did. So there you go. Because the bottom is intersecting with the ground. So it thinks it's colliding with it. And because of the weight of the building, that is a significant enough collision that it is breaking the constraints. And interestingly, to me, if we turn off our piece visibility, you can see how it's propagating up the building. That's what we've been talking about, that propagate iterations, propagate strength. When it breaks this on the first frame, there is a strength to that break, an impulse. And then the next constraints will say, am I strong enough to resist that? If not, I break too, and so on. And it'll lessen over time, so it may not reach the top, but more collisions are occurring down here all the time. So in our case, I think it probably will get to the top. Now, that's not what we want in any case, so I'm just not going to pursue that any further. But that is a pretty good visualization of what's going on with the propagation iterations. So if we come back to our RBD configure, I alluded earlier to changing some things on here. On our RBD configure, there's this notion of whether a piece is active or not. A good idea with buildings is to make the very foundation of them, because really, a real building would have a foundation even underground that is solid. So we want to say all pieces are active, right? They're all active. But let's make another page here by pressing the plus here. Go to the second page and make sure that this happens on the second page and not the first page. But some pieces should not be active, the ones in the bottom. And in fact, any piece whose y position, so p dot y, any piece whose y position is less than 1, meaning just 1 unit from the bottom, make them inactive. So if we look at our proxy, and again, look at the proxy and not the high-res, look at the proxy, because these are the simulation pieces. If I come here and I find active, some pieces should be 0, and most of them should be 1, and that's what we're seeing. As usual, we can see a little bit easier if I say active equals 0. And remember to change this to points, delete non-selected. So this is our foundation that will never move. This will never be simulated. I mean, it's in the simulation as a collider, but it will not be simulated, meaning it's not going to collide at the very least with the ground. That will enable this to work correctly. If I press play now, it actually simulates quite fast because the only possible collision to happen can't happen, and everything that's glued together will also not collide with each other. So there's really no collisions going on here at all. This is all functioning as one big piece, and there's nothing for it to collide against. So it's a fast simulation. So here's a funny thing though. If I were to turn our metaball back on though, should that force break our glue collisions? Or glue bindings? It doesn't. And that's because only collisions will break glue bindings. Just adding a force attribute, as this is doing to our sim, which would drive the velocity of it, these things can't move in the first place because of the glue. So we need to remove these bindings ourselves. And we'll do that based off where the metaball is, but not actually using the force. So we'll do that in the next chapter.